If you're a creator, listening to this conversation could save you countless hours of stress and potentially thousands in costs.
Some creators are very good at reading and reviewing and negotiating their own contracts. Some are the complete opposite.
As a creator, there's an area of your creator business which you just simply cannot ignore: legal issues.
Is kind of dictated by the law.
Well, this is today's topic. Whether you like it or not, the success of your creator journey will depend on how you navigate the legal system.
All sorts of legal issues that you should be thinking of, like intellectual property rights, who actually owns the creations you're creating if someone's doing it for you.
There are so many questions in this area, such as where do you even start? What do you need to look out for in contracts? And how can you protect your business? Well, today's expert is a perfect guest to answer these questions. Kush Birdi is the managing partner of Birdie Co. They've advised on everything from corporate finance to influencer sponsorship contracts. In today's episode, we'll be going over all the key areas of the legal system you've always wanted to know about. So, Kush, you are co-founder and managing partner of Birdie Co. You've handled everything from corporate law, banking and finance, employment law, and you've also worked with influencers and content creators about the legal aspects of their journey. So let's start with a really basic question. If there's a creator listening to this who wants to build a business, what are the most important legal considerations they need to be aware of?
Great question. First of all, thanks for having me here. And it's a really, really important topic that you're raising, and I'm really glad that you're putting it out there. So first of all, I think it's important to appreciate what you've just said. Creators looking to start a business, that's exactly what it is. You launching a business, creators often think that they're maybe just creating content, putting it out there, and they don't actually realize they're running a business. And if they are trying to monetize it, then they need to treat it like a business and run it, set it up professionally. So that means making sure you've got legal support with the contracts that you're entering into. If you've got any support, video editors, freelancers, that kind of stuff, then you need to make sure you've got the correct contracts in place. And the same applies for all types of advisors, in terms of having the tax set up right and your accountants, making sure that all the bookkeeping is correct, and making sure, just back to legal, there's all sorts of legal issues that you should be thinking of, like intellectual property rights, who actually owns the creations you're creating. If someone's doing it for you, do you actually own them? What if not? Then how can you use them and for how long? These types of things I'm sure we'll delve into more. But these are some of the legal issues that you should be thinking of. Because we're talking about legal, so. Yeah,
absolutely. And just while you were saying all those things, I was like, wow, there's so much to talk about.
Much.
Let's just start with the real basics. So let's say you've got a content creator and they've not set up a business yet and they are literally just posting stuff. Can we maybe start with an introduction, the difference between sole trader compared to limited legally?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the first thing to appreciate is when you are content creating and you're starting or running your business, which it is, then not only are you hopefully going to monetize that and create revenue from that, but you're also liable for certain things. So you're liable for the content you create, potentially. You're liable for contracts that you enter into, et cetera, et cetera. So the liability that you're potentially exposed to depends on what your activities are. So if you're running as a sole trader, then it means effectively, you're running in your own name.
It's on you.
It's on you. The contracts you enter in your personal name. And if anything goes wrong, then as you say, it's on you. Your personal finances are on the hook, potentially assets, etc. If you're in your own home, then those kinds of things are going to be exposed to that liability. So one of the ways to kind of shield against that, I suppose, is to set up a company structure where you have a company, you own the company and you run the company, but all the contracts, for example, are entered into by the company, because a company can do that. It has a separate, what we call a legal personality in itself. And that is going to shield you against personal liabilities. I mean, there are exceptions to that rule, which I won't go into now.
What are the exceptions? No, I'm interested. Go on.
Well, no, there are some exceptions. Obviously, if you're undertaking any kind of fraudulent activity or undertaking certain activities intentionally to avoid stuff, there is a concept called piercing the corporate veil, which again I won't go into because it's quite jargony, let's say, and quite theory-based, where you can actually look through the company and still incur personal liability. So it's not the be all and end all, but for most situations you're going to be okay, provided you're trading honestly or those kinds of things. So and that's what the limited company structure is for. Obviously with that means you're going to have to set up your company entity as a company, etc. You're going to register with HMRC. You're going to have to file accounts every year and update the public record of ownership of that company, that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I'm sure we'll come onto it shortly in terms of personal investing for creators. And company vehicles can be used in a way which is flexible and to enable other types of investments as well, which is like any business. And I think that's quite an advantage too.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got kind of the main options of the sole trader option. The downside of that is, just to kind of double click on that, is that if something goes wrong, you're potentially legally responsible. And something that I saw from a sponsorship coach is he was going through a contract and he was saying, look, I'm not a lawyer. But one of the key things he was mentioning is there was the condition in the contract where it said that if there was something wrong with the contract, potentially they would be also responsible, the creator who'd put it out there. Now, obviously, we're not going to discuss kind of those kind of contracts, but I think it just kind of really reinforces that it's really important to understand what you're getting into, because people might be thinking, okay, I'm just posting some stuff online. But if you're not aware of your legal responsibilities and it's in your name, that could be everything you own on the hook, potentially, if it went really wrong. Mm-hmm. How difficult is it setting up a company as far as the legal structure? Because I think one of the things that, and I'd love to hear your insight in relation to this, which is, and we're not going to go into accountancy stuff, but more in relation to the fact that it's quite difficult from creators, especially at the start, to know when is the right time to get kind of the right level of advice. Like if you've got a creator who's maybe earning, 50 grand, 100 grand a year, it's difficult to know when the right time is to, get your legal professionals in place to make sure that they dot the I's and cross the T's. From your side, what are the kind of the pitfalls to be aware of when setting up a company legally?
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of sort of timing, just to touch upon that if I can, I think that it's important to stand back and sort of say, well, what am I trying to achieve here? Firstly, I'm content creating. If you already started and you're earning, any type of money, you should still think about what the objective is here. Why am I doing this? How am I going to protect myself? You may decide, well, okay, I'm going to set up a company from the beginning. Some people might think that it's more professional or, liability, those kinds of things. If you're already kind of operating and you're in your own name, it's not a problem. It's very easy to set up a limited company. Mm-hmm. You can just do it online yourself. If you're not sure how to do it, you can have a professional do it for you. Someone like ourselves could do that. It's relatively simple. And what that means is, the difficulty is that the longer you continue sort of creating, or the gap between starting creating and setting up your company, if that's what you decide to do, the more complex it can be, because you have to kind of transfer contracts across to the company, potentially. You'll need a bank account for your company. You shouldn't be using your own personal bank account. You should be using your company's bank account. And if you are transferring contracts to your company, you might need to engage with brands to get their consent, for example, and they may not be comfortable with engaging your company. So it is that in terms of pitfalls, which is, pitfalls, I would say, make sure you are doing those things, because if you're setting up a company and you're not transferring sort of the benefits of your creator's business into that company, then you're not really doing things correctly, and potentially, the value of that company, if you're looking to create value, is going to be nothing, because the contract, let's say, still in your own name. Yeah. So liability is still with you, even though you're running with this company. Does that make sense? So 100%. You kind of really need that kind of, if you're not sure what you're doing, then to get that advice to make sure that it is all transferred across. And I know we're not going into tax and stuff, but there can be tax implications which are relevant as well. And I think if you're co-creating, for example, if you're in business with somebody else, then it's really important to make sure, if you are owning a company, you understand how that company is owned, what proportions it's owned, who has the control of that company. If it's equal, then you need to have some kind of written agreement in place to regulate that relationship, so that to be clear, firstly, on what responsibilities and authority everybody has, and also if something doesn't go quite right, then there's a reference point as to what is supposed to happen in that situation. And I could talk whole separate podcast on that. But yeah, happy to.
I wanted to get you back on that, actually. Yeah, for sure.
Can I tell you something that a lot of financial advisors won't? You are allowed to enjoy your money and build wealth. You don't have to choose either or. The problem is, nobody's ever shown you how your finances work with your creator business. You might be following advice designed for people with steady paychecks and pension schemes and wondering why it feels impossible to get that balance right. What I've done is I've created the Creator Wealth Blueprint. It's a free guide that maps out exactly what your financial moves might be at every step, from getting your house in order financially all the way to kind of family office territory. And you might wish someone had handed it to you years ago. Download, link is below or on the QR code. Go get it.
I think one of the things you've really highlighted is kind of, it's about how seriously you're taking things ultimately, as far as how much of this as your content journey is a business. And I think what you've touched upon, which is great, is that even if it's something which you're not necessarily looking to scale hugely, you still need to be aware of the liabilities in place, even if you're a sole trader. Are there protections that even sole traders, so people who don't go down the limited liability or the limited company position, are there protections that they can put in place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are things you can do to mitigate that risk. Firstly, you can negotiate the contracts before signing them to try and limit your exposure, like caps on liability or time limits on liability, or negotiating the wording, especially if it's a higher value contract, then it is definitely worth doing that. And sometimes we do engage with clients to make sure they're actually negotiating the agreements. Brands do negotiate, believe it or not, they do.
Oh yeah, they do.
I think some creators think they just have to sign it. It's a take it or leave it. But sometimes it is like that, but quite often it's not. What else can they do? There is insurance available.
I was going to ask.
So you can get things like, indemnity insurance or liability cover. I don't know about the range of what, products or kind of policies are out there. So you need to engage some kind of, insurance broker of some kind. It's not something we could advise on, but it does exist. And they could speak with you about what levels of cover you require, what it covers. Does it cover things like intellectual property warranties that you might have to give in your creators agreements, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, great. Okay, so there's something you can do even for the sole trader. Now let's kind of move up the risk scale, because I think most people, or the development scale I should probably say, because I think most people listening to this will be people who either have their own businesses or well within the journey. So one of the things you said a second ago was in relation to if you go into business with someone. And that's actually a really hot topic, and I've spoken to quite a few creators about that, where they've got everything, where for example, they've got a really big channel, and maybe they've got someone that they want to partner with for an offshoot of the channel. So maybe a different area where they have expertise, maybe in newsletters or maybe a podcast or whatever. And they want to bring someone on board, but part and parcel is kind of an equity stake. They want a piece of the pie of the new business. What do creators have to be aware of if they're getting into things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that first of all, there are many advantages that are available for going into business together with others. So before we go into kind of what the negatives might be or what the risks are, there are definitely advantages.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So that's really positive.
I'm just a bit of a lone wolf.
But I think that in terms of, if you are going to kind of joint venture with somebody, if that's what I could call it as a broad term, then and there's common equity stake, then you really need to understand, what that means legally. So if you have a typical limited company with, let's say, 50-50 shares or some other proportion, then what that means is two different people or entities or whatever own that company. So if something goes wrong, then both parties are responsible, although the company's liable. Both own the share. So that's a good thing in terms of like commitment, let's say. But what happens if one of the parties is not performing their role, let's say? Is there actually a reference point as to what their role is, what they should be doing? So there should be some kind of written document, what the main one is called a shareholders agreement, actually setting out what is expected of one another. That's firstly. But then there's a bunch of other things as well, like what do you get for the equity? So if there's profits, for example, is that person able to have a share of the profits annually, let's say, or are you actually looking to sell off that company at some point? Maybe not, I'm not sure. In which case, is it only a share of that sale, for example? If that's what it is, it depends on the situation. And also, who has the ultimate control on the final say over what happens with that with that company.
Yeah.
You need to think about these things. Every case is different. If it's 50-50, then you're more likely to have some kind of collaboration. If it's, some other proportion, or there's a very high minority proportion, then there's less control there for the minority. But then you've got to think, well, if I'm a minority shareholder and I own like 10% or 20% of a company, then it's like, what protection do I have for what I own? And it's making sure that there's a written document in place that actually explains that. And there are lots of other things as well. What if one of the parties wants to leave the company and sell their equity stake to a third party?
Yeah.
Nobody wants that situation of not knowing who they're now going to be in business with, because that kind of doesn't make sense. Because I went into business with you.
Yeah.
You can't sell your equity to somebody else, and I'm in business with them. But that has to be documented.
Yeah.
And what if something, obviously touch wood, but if one of the parties dies, has medical issues, then what happens in that instance with the equity? All of these things have to be considered, and we regularly sort of deal with those things.
Okay, so let's let's talk performance first, because that was the first thing you touched on that I was interested about, which is that, okay, so let's say that you start in business and it's 50-50 and it's you and whoever, and they're not pulling their weight. What do you do? Like, legally, what are your options? Or better yet, probably a better wording of the question is, how do you both incentivize good behavior at the start?
To be honest, it is incredibly difficult. I mean, the amount of I can't tell you the amount of times that I see co-owners, they haven't got a written agreement in place. Something's gone wrong. They haven't necessarily fallen out, but sometimes they have.
Yeah.
But not necessarily. Sometimes just kind of like, well, this person's not doing what I thought they would do. Okay, well, what did you think they would do? And then there's no reference point. What did they think they would do? And having that written down is not always about, oh, I'm going to enforce this in court if this goes wrong. It's just about getting it on the paper and making sure there is a legal incentive to perform those duties. So if it's in a legal agreement, that is an incentive in a way. And it's clear, and there's a reference point, something you can actually point to. If you're not going to do that, then you're risking a lot of stress, financial burden in the form of legal costs to try and resolve the issue. But really, it's the stress factor. Why would you not invest a couple of £100 or sometimes a couple of £1,000 to protect against that and give you the peace of mind that both parties should need, or if it's more than two, then all parties should need, to focus on the creation and not focus so much on, well, she was meant to do this, he was meant to do that, have that documented. And it's more professional as well. And you're going to reduce the risk of disagreements and disputes, or the resolution of disagreements at least.
Yeah.
And to answer the question of what do you do if someone's not pulling their weight? Well, hopefully, if you've provided in the agreement for what would happen in that instance, if somebody's materially not performing their duties, is there an obligation to give up their equity, or give up their equity at a discount, or some kind of I don't like to use the word penalty, but some kind of disincentive not to perform, let's say, then that's really the main port of call, to be honest with you. But then there are more practical things like talk to them and meet with them and all those kinds of things. But I'm assuming you've tried all those things first, right? But if it's in there, if me and you go into business together and there's a document which states I've got to do X, Y, and Z, that can be pointed to, I'm more likely to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, that's great. And the thing that I love about kind of even just talking about this kind of stuff is that it brings up to the conversations that they're sometimes difficult conversations, but it's way easier to have these conversations at the start than have them at the middle or the end if you've not done the preparation. Because I can imagine if you've not got a shareholder agreement and you're trying to work all this stuff out, it's a nightmare. Just something you touched upon before was in relation to different kind of segments of ownership, or maybe even different levels of control. Is that done by dual class shares and different voting rights? Do you have a typical way that would happen?
Yeah, that's how it would happen. Yeah, because some people might put like a heavy financial investment in, but not do as much, for example.
Right.
Someone might be the pure creator and the face of the brand that's being created. Someone might be operationally the best, or more in the background. And then you just have to think about what everyone wants from the situation as well. It really depends. So some people might not want to actually take income from the business and maybe just keep reinvesting it and growing it, but someone might be reliant on that income to live, which is not uncommon at all, as we all know. So it's about having those conversations, and yeah, you can, if you do need to distinguish between rights, then you can have separate classes of share, which is effectively what that is.
Yeah, so just for the purpose of the audience, dual class shares effectively just allow different rights to be associated with the company. So you might have someone who has voting rights, you might have some who has income and capital rights, and it just effectively allows people to be a bit more flexible about what they get from the company, and so people can make different decisions. There was something you touched on there, which I just want to kind of go back to in relation to I think it touches upon intellectual property, which is a lot of creators I speak to, they sometimes are the face of the brand. So maybe they've got a lot of people who follow them. They've maybe built a brand on top of that, which is heavily kind of linked to their name. So a typical example might be, say, for example, like a fashion creator who's got their own fashion brand and all the rest of it. In relation to kind of the intellectual property in the creator economy, how does this work? Like, I know that's a naive question, but I genuinely want to know, because like, is it that the platform owns all the content, and then how do they separate from the brand rights? How does that work? Just give me an overview.
It's very multifaceted.
Right.
We could talk about loads of different things. We could talk about creating your own content. We could talk about using AI to create content and how that works. In terms of how it works, my understanding is that the main social media platforms allow creators to retain their intellectual property rights in their content.
Interesting.
And reuse them. But then the creator gives the platform a license to use or the right to use that content, of course, because they need to put it on the platform, and to distribute it, I suppose, how they wish. So broadly speaking, you get to keep your own content, is my understanding of the platform's terms, but they do change. So that's that side of it.
Yeah.
In terms of if you have going back to this situation of co-ownership of a company and intellectual property rights, then again, the general rule is that the person that created the content owns the intellectual property, for example, copyright.
Right.
So what that means is if you've got two owners creating copyright, then they need to make sure they're putting that copyright into the company. So what that means is ideally you should have a contract with the company to say that all the intellectual property created for the purposes or in connection with this company is the company's. Yeah. Now that may not always be the case, because as you say, if you've got, I think your original scenario was someone that's got a brand and that they've got like an offset, they're creating an offset of that brand. It may be for whatever commercial reason that the creator needs to retain the full intellectual property in the substantive brand, but so they might be able to license it to the secondary company, for example. That may be the situation. That could be without a fee, that could be with a fee. But again, that needs to be documented. So you need to think about these things. I had a previous client that was a TikTok creator with a few million followers.
Right.
And that particular client, we advised on not just contracts, but intellectual property implications of the contract. And all of these things came up. And when you actually have the conversations with the creators, the usual response I get is, no, that is so important. I mean,
yeah, I bet.
I need to make sure that's covered. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And sometimes projects have already kicked off.
I bet.
And
and been paid for.
Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah.
And so that's really important, because trying to document it retrospectively is obviously more difficult.
Yeah.
And we maybe come on to an example about that as well anyway. But yeah.
Yes, it is such a minefield, isn't it? Because for example, like let's say this is the Creator Finance podcast, and I do 1,000 episodes, and I'm the face of it, and I have a personal brand. Now, if you paid for the Creator Finance podcast and you didn't have a written contract in relation to because I could argue, oh no, I've got my own following and that's kind of what's driving it, but you could be like, well, actually, I'm the one who's been stumping up a decent amount of capital for the Creator Finance brand in this example. How does intellectual property and image rights differ? And is there any kind of like big gap that we need to be aware of when considering this?
That's a tough one.
Sorry. Next episode, you'll be grilling me on like pension legislation and personal finance.
And we'll try and answer this one. Because intellectual property rights are so multifaceted, when we're talking about intellectual property rights, for example, the creation of this podcast.
Yes.
Okay. So hopefully the studio give you the rights in the
yeah, no, I do. I've checked the contract.
The audio and the video, which I would expect to be the case. So that means, and I assume that you've had to pay for this. Yes. So you would own the intellectual property rights to the podcast.
Right.
However, to create the podcast, you're using my images. Mm-hmm. So really, I have rights over my imagery. And technically speaking, you should ask me to waive those rights, which we will.
Actually, you mentioned it. No,
you may not want to put that part in the podcast.
No,
but it doesn't
happen.
Will. I mean, I've been on several podcasts and I've never been asked to sign an imagery away.
No, me neither.
For example, but it should technically happen.
Right.
In terms of any gaps, well, I mean, the gap is understanding that the intellectual property rights at a base level, which in this context would be copyrights, are distinct from image rights for the reasons that I've given. So I have a right over my images being used in your podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, it's a difficult one.
No, it's a great insight, because what it speaks to, which is the kind of the entire reason that I really, really want to have you on, is that it is a bit of a minefield. Like the amount of actually, and it's less of an issue when we're kind of joking about the sort of the Creator Finance podcast and all the rest of it. But when you're getting to people who have really substantial followings and serious monetization off the back of that, not having those areas clarified is huge. Okay, so we've talked about legal, we've talked about limited companies, we've talked about potential hiccups. What are the legal aspects beyond that you think are crucial for content creators to understand that are maybe misunderstood?
Well, no, I think it's just understanding, beyond contract and intellectual property rights, it's understanding that, it's back to the original point of you're running a business, you need to treat it as a business. For example, Creator Finance podcast, really you should consider trademarking that name, for example, because that's what's going to underpin the value of the name of the podcast, especially if it grows to be substantial, which you may not expect, or you may expect, but it may happen quicker than you expect, for example. So by having that registered protection in place, is going to enhance your brand and ultimately the value of that brand. So that's great. I think it's important to think about those things. And if you're, or if anyone is working with consultants or professionals that they're outsourcing editorial stuff to, for example, then it's making sure that those intellectual property rights are captured by you as well, not just the intellectual property rights you create. And having proper contracts in place with your freelancers and having thinking about data protection and having, if you're using personal data, names and et cetera of others in your creations, then you need to think about the data protection implications of that too.
Yeah, and let's touch upon an area which can be very thorny for content creators is kind of, okay, so they've got the limited now. Maybe they've gone into business and they've set up shareholder agreements, but now they need to expand the team, and employing people or even just getting freelancers can be a bit tricky. What are the pitfalls that they might need to be aware of contractually when trying to bring people on board?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to appreciate is you can't necessarily choose whether someone is an employee, a freelancer, or self-employed. That is kind of dictated by the law. So, for example, you might have a piece of paper which says self-employed freelancer, whereas actually if they're working for you full-time...
Oh, they're a test. Yeah, they're tests, aren't they?
Yeah, they're only working for you. They're not working for anybody else. Yeah. Then, you're at risk because under employment legislation, they could be entitled to employment rights, such as holiday pay, sick pay, all these types of things, notice, all these other statutory maternity pay leave, etc., all these things would apply. And not just that, but from tax perspective as well, then you should be potentially withholding the PAYE, for example, that that person should be paying on their income and passing it over to HMRC directly and actually treating them as an employee on payroll. So sometimes we advise clients where it's, this person's probably an employee. Like, are you aware of this? And they say, I had no idea. I just signed them up as a freelancer. And they've got here's the freelancer agreement, 1 page. So it's important to get the right advice in that regard. And also, when you are having the contract in place, then you need the right contract in place. And it needs to, if they are self-employed, genuinely self-employed, then it's making sure that the contract does state they're responsible for their own taxes. And if they were determined to be an employee or worker for whatever reason, that then you have protection that they're going to effectively cover your losses in a way if you were deemed to get it wrong. So that is important. I think also if you are taking on staff, etc., then it's also you've got to consider what other activities they're undertaking. If they're working with you, who else are they working with in the same space? Is that going to affect how you work?
Conflicts of interest and stuff.
Conflicts of interest, but also just confidentiality. If they're genuinely allowed to work with others, which is quite common, you get people that are genuinely freelancers and they're working with multiple people. It's like, who are they working with? Who are they allowed to work with? Who are they not allowed to work with? And there are various legal intricacies to that, because the more restrictive you are, the more likely they are to be regarded as an employee. So there's all these kinds of.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's quite. There's no kind of one size fits all situation.
So we've talked about getting things in place at the start. We've talked about the different responsibilities for a limited sole trader. We've talked about the potential pitfalls and certainly things to be aware of in relation to bringing people on board. Let's go through a practical example, because on your website, you mentioned supporting an online retail business kind of founded by a well-known Instagram blogger, and you did various legal matters helping them in relation to freelancer agreements, non-disclosure, proposed investment, corporate restructuring. Now, clearly, you're not going to be able to give anything confidential. I don't want you to do that. But why don't you just walk me through what their experience was? Because I think it'll be really interesting for the audience. Imagine they are that creator and they've come to you. What happened in that situation?
Well, yeah, of course, without sort of mentioning anything confidential, of course, I think that, creators or bloggers, they can actually grow quicker than they expect. And when that happens, they can go from, for example, somebody that just starts their creating process, doesn't really know anything about legal. They're really good creators. They're very engaging on social media, et cetera, and then all of a sudden they've got a massive following. They've got to deal with the ASA and all the rules around advertising, et cetera, that they've got to comply with, all that kind of stuff, cap codes, etc., which are all really, really important. And the bigger you get, the more you're like to be pulled up on those things. And there are some recent stories on that.
Grace Beverley, I think, got caught out by it, and she's quite a big.
Yeah. I think they don't slap everybody on the wrist, for example, but I think they do try to make some examples, and usually they'd make examples of sort of the bigger kind of creators. So. Yeah, I think so. We were drawn in to help with all sorts of things like freelancer agreements, as I mentioned, so that the types of issues that we've spoken about before, the types of issues we advised on, absolutely, and managed to do that. And to be honest, it was really helpful for the client, because they didn't know, and they did need to do things properly, and even with like contracts that they were entering into, they just didn't know what they were doing with contracts. Some creators are very good at reading and reviewing and negotiating their own contracts. Some are the complete opposite, and that's absolutely okay. But I think as you grow, that these types of issues come to the surface, because it becomes more important.
Yes,
I mean, it's always important, but it becomes more valuable. Let's say
the risk to the downside.
The risk is greater.
Yeah.
So, and the gain is higher sometimes. So it's really important to secure that and mitigate the risks, and that's what we did. So,
yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so one of the things in relation to sponsorship contracts that I've kind of heard about is certainly in relation to control effing the word perpetuity, and and basically sometimes them coming back and. I'll be honest, it seems like sometimes the brand deals when they write the contracts are kind of putting it in a position where they're, I wouldn't say taking advantage of the creator, but it's certainly not in their favor, the contracts, in relation to, wanting the rights in perpetuity, which basically means forever. And, kind of really hiding in a lot of legal language, which I think for creators can be really intimidating because, we're not lawyers. What is kind of at a high level, do you think people need to watch out for in brand deals legally?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things. I think if I just think through kind of like a skeleton contract that I would typically see, the obviously usage is, as you mentioned, is really, really important.
Just go over usage rights and what that means.
So when you're creating content, if you're engaged by a brand to create content or distribute content, etc., if you've created that, then you're giving the brand rights to use that content. Not just use that content, but you may actually be signing over all the rights to that contract, ownership of that content. Now, what you do not want to be doing is giving that away forever as part of the agreement, unless you've kind of negotiated like a proportionate uplift to the fees, because then the brands will be laughing away because they've got the rights and they can ask you to stop using it, which you don't want. So ideally, preferably, you're going to be negotiating a proportionate usage right. If you've created the content for a particular project or particular length of time, then you're going to want to make sure that those are documented in there to be proportionate to what the brands use, what they want, and not really above that unless they're paying extra for it or there's some kind of ongoing gain for you or upfront gain for you. So that's usage, really.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've kind of heard, and maybe you can correct me on this, is that there's a creator who's done a brand deal, they've given them a bit of contract, they've not really read the contracts, and then they suddenly realise that they're being ran on ads, really aggressively, and there's literally nothing they can do about it.
Yeah.
I think there's different types of rights that you potentially sign. Could you speak to that at all in relation to the ability to put money behind the ads versus maybe just run on a platform? Is there anything that you could speak to in relation to that?
Certainly, you can obviously negotiate the wording of the agreement.
Yeah,
you can use content for this, but not for X, but not for Y.
Yeah.
That would be the most logical way to deal with it. In fact, I had a client that created some content. I'm not going to say the nature of it, just to keep it broad. Created some content for a brand for one particular purpose, but then I think it was a few years later that they actually saw that same content in a completely different situation, and the brand refused to take it down, even though the creator didn't want that to be used or distributed in another way.
Oh, really?
And they weren't able to do anything about it because they'd signed the agreement, which gave away all the rights. So that's quite important, especially if creators are if it's like appearance based, for example, as well, and preferences upon people's own appearances can change as well, then that can be quite sensitive for a creator.
Yeah.
So
especially ethically, if they've got certain views and they find themselves aligned with something that they wouldn't want to be.
Completely, that's also true. Completely, yeah.
Just out of interest, do Birdie Co, do you do kind of, let's say you've got a creator who wants to be on the front foot with brand deals and wants sort of like a boilerplate kind of contract, which they could then utilize potentially with sponsors. Is that the kind of work that you do typically? Do you do any kind of work? So if a creator was to contact you and go, okay, I keep getting things offered to me from sponsors, I'd really like to be on the front foot and actually have, this is my standard terms. Is that the kind of work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. We would do that. I think it can be difficult because brands, for example, usually would say, well, no, you have to use our terms because we have contractual policies and all this kind of infrastructure in place that they have to follow. But that's not to say that those contracts can't be negotiated. And it's not to say that the contracts, they wouldn't receive the creator's contract as well. But obviously, if you are going to invest that money in legal advice to have it like a standard template, it may not be like possible to use it like on a widespread basis, for example, like with anybody, because they may not accept that. We do that. We also act on the brand side to have sort of influencer agreements, etc., prepared, and we act for agencies as well. Right. So we've got a couple of influencer agency clients where we've done their standard terms. with the brands and with the influencers themselves on the agency agreements themselves.
Yeah, it just kind of, this whole conversation just makes you realize how many things that you might not have thought of that you need to really be aware of. It just, as far as protecting yourself. I just want to kind of go to, there was a podcast that I listened to a while ago. It was called The Break, and basically it was about a very well-known content creator who basically had an app that they had a deal with. And one of the things that they mentioned on the podcast was basically they said that, okay, part of the deal that they'd done, effectively the intellectual property for the app, they didn't own. So they basically were the face of it, but they owned nothing of the intellectual property. And what they said on the podcast was basically the app is effectively, if you don't have the intellectual property, what you own is near worthless, or it's certainly nowhere near as valuable as the IP. Could you just expand on that for the layperson, why that would be so problematic?
Yeah, I mean, I know the example that you're citing.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, because you sent
I sent you the link. Yeah, I did send you the link.
So I did look at it, and I don't know why that happened at all.
Right.
But although I really do like the creator,
Right.
It's just so important, because if you're going to have an app, for example, created, then a lot of the value is in kind of like the underlying creation. So, for example, the code behind the app and the aesthetics of it, et cetera, rather than kind of the information as such that's used by it. So to not have the right to that is kind of disastrous, really, because how are you going to monetize that? How are you going to adapt that? How are you going to ensure that it's unique to you and your customers, where the person that created it for you actually has the rights to it, so could technically duplicate it for another customer or use it themselves. So that's disastrous, really, especially if it becomes massive, which in that case I think it was quite large. So you've really restricted yourself in terms of the gain from that creation. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think there are some things in life which are costs and others investments. And the thing is, with really good legal advice, I think it's really clear how much of an investment it can be, because, especially if you're a creator who's built an audience, you've got that trust. If you're in a position where maybe you start an app and you don't own any of the IP, or maybe you start a business and you don't have the necessary, or as professional as it probably should be, a contract in relation to exiting and all the rest of it, that's not so much of a problem when you've only got a couple of thousand of followers, or maybe even earning a couple of £1,000s. But if that turns into a multi-million-pound business, and this is going to happen again and again in the creator economy because it's booming so much, that becomes a real issue. What point do you think a content creator should get someone like yourself involved? Because I think that's often can be a bit of a challenge for creators as far as knowing when to bring on board a legal professional.
Yeah, I think, the obvious answer is straight away, but I think practically speaking, I think creators can feel intimidated by sort of the legal
We all are.
infrastructure. I am most of the time, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So I think that the practical answer is as soon as possible, as early as possible, even if it is to have a conversation with a solicitor, someone like myself or my team, is the practical way to go, because you don't know what you don't know. And it shouldn't cost you to have that initial call, 15, 20-minute call with a solicitor. They shouldn't try and charge you for that. And it's just about knowing what you might need, what you don't need, and the kinds of things to think about. So, and also just to get yourself into the motion of it, like have that conversation, schedule it, request a video call, for example, and it is more personable than you think. It's not as intimidating as you think, but it is probably more important than you think. So it really just makes sense just to start the process straight away, so that you can make sure you're going down the right path.
Yeah, it all comes back to how seriously you're going to take it, and ultimately, if you have anything of value in life, it's kind of a problem deferred, isn't it? Ultimately, if you don't get these things in place, because it's gonna rear its ugly head. It may, when you start to want to try and sell, It may, if you unfortunately have some issues in relation to your business partner, there's going to be hiccups in the road because that's business. So it's about having that protection in place. Just on that, actually, on going to business with someone else, let's talk about, okay, what happens if someone gets ill? What happens if one of your partners in relation to the business partner suddenly passes away? This is kind of where we dice and talk into cross-option agreements and all the rest of it. But let's just overview them because I think it's an area that people don't talk about very often. So
Sure.
what can people do?
Okay, so typical scenario would be company operating, multiple owners, or let's say two joint owners. Something unfortunate is happening to one of them, either are medically ill, so they're not actually able to perform their part of the business. Or if they have passed away, unfortunately, then it's, well, okay, what happens to those shares or that equity stake? That's the situation we're talking about. And obviously, apart from the emotional side, we do have to think about what is the legal situation. Hopefully, in the shareholders agreement, it would state something like, business partner has passed away, I get to buy them out, let's say. And usually it would be kind of like a market value type situation in that scenario. Now, if the business has grown to be of a quite significant value, then that's obviously going to be really important to consider in terms of the affordability of buying that party out that's passed away. And there is insurance available called, cross-option insurance, which effectively allows the surviving partner to buy out the deceased partner at the relevant insured rate, let's say, and the insurance policy would pay out for that. Of course, there's premiums involved, etc. But that's the basic concept to fund the buyout of the business partner that's unfortunately passed away.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. And obviously, passing away is kind of the disaster scenario. So just kind of to repeat for the audience, effectively, you've got a scenario where you put something in place because, just to clarify the problem, you don't want to be in a position where something bad happens to someone who you're reliant on in business, and then something happens to them, and it might not be them necessarily passing away. There are other things to consider. What happens if they have serious mental health issues and they can no longer work in the business? That needs to be considered legally. What happens if they're too ill? What happens if... But how a cross-option agreement works is effectively you consider putting some insurance in place, and it's agreed that effectively the shares are purchased so that then the beneficiary, or typically like the spouse or the dependent of one of the partners who's passed away, then gets money, but you can continue working in the business, and you're not in this horrible position where ultimately that value of the business has gone to the estate or to the beneficiary, and then you're kind of stuck, because what happens if they're part of the business and they're needed for key decisions?
Yeah,
it's a real nightmare, and it can put your business under real threat, can't it?
Yeah, it can kill the business. It can, and then often the beneficiaries of the partner that's passed away, or spouse, etc., often don't want to be involved with the business because it's not their thing, or it's not their expertise, or they don't have the know-how to fulfill that function. So it's actually in their interest to be bought out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's potentially about protecting the business. What are are there any key legal issues that are emergent? Because, the hot topic is AI at the moment, clearly. People are obviously very focused on that. Are there any legal issues that you can see in the creator economy that make you think, that's something people really need to watch out for?
Well, AI is the main one in my opinion. I think it's going to be heavily involved across all sectors, including the legal sector as well, and creator economy. So that is something that is really important. It goes into intellectual property, firstly, in terms of who owns the rights to this content. I believe at the moment the creator inputting the information into the kind of the AI machine, or at least the OpenAI ChatGPT function anyway, the creator that owns the intellectual property right there. But then there's also issues of whether that information is correct, up to date, whether you could be accidentally saying something incorrect about another party, and that could actually be what we would call
defamatory.
Defamatory, yeah. Which can expose you to again, liability. Yeah. So you really need to fact check the outputs of the AI functions, because they can get you into hot water as well, for sure. Or it could be advertising which is misleading. Maybe you need to make sure it's correct. So that's something that I imagine to give rise to some issues, and I'm sure there'll be some kind of shots fired in terms of on that.
This is kind of not necessarily related directly to the creator economy, but one of the big things about LLMs is that they're taking information from the web, and there's a real question about intellectual property about the information they're taking as well from it, and actually whether they're infringing on copyright by scrolling the web. Yeah, that's going to be an interesting area. Are there any? What's your thoughts on that whole thing?
It's just really true. I think that it's really complicated at the moment because it's like the number of issues you can't really kind of list out, let's say, because you just mentioned another one, and if you're then using another program to generate images, then you've got the image rights as well that we were just talking about before. So then how does that work?
So what point does it tread from fair use into that?
100%. So all of these legal issues are going to crop up in significant ways, I believe, and it's quite exciting, but also
it's a good time to be a lawyer.
But also it's really important to make sure you are treading carefully and getting the right advice along the way.
Yeah, 100%. So what we've talked about from the start is we've talked about the difference between sole trader and limited company, and why the pitfalls you need to be aware of, the liabilities you need to be aware of there. You've then got your position where you've maybe set up a limited company, but it doesn't stop there. You need to be really aware as a creator in relation to, okay, if you're bringing on board people, do you have the right shareholder agreements in place? Is a fruitful future relationship, is that kind of contractually in place, or are you potentially setting yourself and your business partner potentially up for a fall? We've then got the issues around, or the considerations around, bringing people on board. Is there freelancer contracts? Is there employment contracts? Issues around there. There's, if you end up kind of building your own business, there's intellectual property. Who owns what? Is it vested in the company? That's another really big thing. What else have we been over? We've been over. I'm just having a look through it all, and we're going over.
Even like competing activities, that kind of stuff. If you're working together, then what is that your business partner able to do outside of that, or not? Are there any restrictions there? Or conflicts?
And then you've got the very complicated area about when, for a creator, does it end in relation to the difference between maybe image rights and brand rights, and what's on either area. God, that's interesting. And then obviously you've got sale. Just out of interest, do you have any insights in relation to, let's say somebody wants to sell their business, any kind of legal issues that tend to come up there?
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of selling businesses and buying businesses. In terms of a creator business, I suppose, before you get to kind of legal issues, well, it is partly a legal issue, but what you're selling, it has to be something of value. So if you're selling a brand, then the legal rights underpinning that brand have to be there in the form of the proper intellectual property rights, in the form of all the other compliance stuff and trademark registrations that you should have in place. So the legal addressing these legal issues is going to enhance the value of the business. That's broadly going to be the truth, right? And
it's going to be essential for the sale of the business, I can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely essential. And I think that if you are selling your business, then it is worth actually gearing up for that and thinking, if that's the strategy, then you should be thinking about that, I would say 2, 3, 4, 5 years in advance. Because it does take time to make sure that all these things are in place and that you're not resolving them at the point of sale, because any buyer is going to come along and say, well, I can't offer you what you want because your brand's not trademarked properly, or because your intellectual documentation is not quite right, and I can't buy that business because I can't be certain that I'm going to get the value from it because it's not protected
because you don't own it.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you really need to think about it in advance.
What do you see for the future of the creator economy?
Lots of things. But I think the role of AI is going to be massive going forward, because you've got, on the one hand, potentially brands looking to use AI to maybe fulfill functions where they don't actually need to sponsor large influencers at large prices, etc. Is there another solution for them? But then, on the other hand, they're going to have the know-how and capability to kind of use those AI functions. So I think that you're also going to see creators becoming experts in the AI functions, because that's how they're going to enhance their value to brands and make sure that they can still continue to charge or what they charge and increase that as well, and also be better than the other creators as well, and separate themselves from the competition. That's what I think is going to be a big feature of the next few years.
Okay, more Money Than Sensei segment. What do you see creators waste money on?
Well, you've obviously got the business side to that, which I guess not so much visibility there, and then the personal side. But I think that there's a lot of, looking at social media and seeing what people put out there about the successful parts of their lives and others, everybody really, not just creators, but trying to keep up with that and try to show that, okay, well, they can do that too. And I'm sure that there's a lot of expenditure there going on that, and probably wastage. I mean, we don't get involved personally with the influencers, but I think that I imagine that the influencers and creators could probably think more about their personal investing. They might be making all this money from creation, etc. But then what are they doing with that? Are they just stacking it, or what they're going to do next with it to create another level of financial independence or wealth, is what I would probably categorize it as.
A life that sustains them.
Yeah, and that's really, really important.
What do you think creators underinvest in?
Legal advice.
Yeah, do you know what? After this conversation, I completely agree.
Yeah, I would
that,
say.
That leads me on to my final question, which, okay, so let's say you've got a content creator who's been listening to this, they're fired up, they want to get in touch with you guys. How do they do that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, social media, Instagram. I'm most active on LinkedIn. So Kush Birdi, you could find me on there.
Kush Birdi Co.
Yeah, and Birdie Co Solicitors. Yeah, absolutely. Please do engage with us, and don't hesitate to send me a DM. The website is birdielaw.com. That's BIRDILAW.com. Right. And you can see some of the work that we do for the creators on there. Or you can email me, Kush, KUSH, @birdielaw.com.
Amazing. Kush, you've been fantastic. Thank you
Thanks
so much
for
for your time.
Really appreciate it.
If you are a creator who's earning 6 or 7 figures and you want to get financial clarity, why not have a quick look at what I'm building? It's www.creatorfinance.co.uk. Going to be the UK's first financial planning practice designed for creators by a creator. And it's built upon the pillars of fixed fee, independent, amazing advice, and community-based support. Genuinely, this is completely unique in the market, and it could change your finances forever. So why don't you have a look at it? creatorfinance.co.uk. Thanks.